Derek Hoy Memorial Lecture here at the RCN, the Royal College of Nursing in Edinburgh. They were willing to host us, and we dragged them into the 21st century through the webcasting. So this is a first time for us, and I hope everything goes well. We're also lucky to have Pam with us. Pam has come yesterday from Ireland to deliver the lecture this year with the title of Understanding Integrated Care. It's about getting the harmony right. And Dr. Pamela Hassi from the School of Nursing and Human Sciences in Dublin City University. She joined the academic community later in life, she tells us, following 20 years as a practice nurse in general medicine. Holding a PhD in computer science, an MSc in education and training management, and an MSc in health informatics, her research interests include concepts and terminology, developing technology, enhanced learning objects, and the electronic health record. Knowing Derek, I'm sure he will agree with us that Pam is the perfect person to give us the fourth Derek Hoy Memorial Lecture, and we're looking forward to hearing you. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And thank you to everybody for coming along today and for this kind invite. I am very honoured to be doing this lecture. As you say, it's understanding integrated care, about getting the harmony right. I suppose the key thing to say is that I do have a PhD in computer science, but I very much take the history of what I've been doing as a nurse for 20 years into that space and try and use it to shape the advocacy role, I suppose, for designing of systems for our service users and patients. So that's really, I suppose, one of the key things that motivates me to work in this space. I want to start really initially by talking about a recent conversation I had with somebody of a similar vintage who came in from Australia for a meeting in Ireland. And while we were having dinner, we were talking about the whole notion of the projects that I've been working on over the last 20-25 years and the impact that those projects have had or not had on health and social care across the continuum. And one of the things that we talked about was how measuring success came into play when you're looking at different projects that you work on. And Heather was the name of the lady I was dealing with. She's an ISO working group convener. And we talked about the fact that there were three options, really, in relation to measuring success. So the first one would probably be that it has the desired impact, and from a business perspective, it's done within budget and time. The second option was really more that the team themselves learned something really significant along the way, and they were able to take that learning into future work as they go forward. And the third one is that they disseminate very well their findings and their work, and that some other groups pick up that work and they move forward with it as they learn and go along the way. Today I'll probably look at some of those three different projects and measuring of the success. And I think the main one really and most important is that legacy of other people's work carries on and moves forward in the work that we do. So I am going to revert to some notes today because I put some time into writing the notes to make sure that I don't miss any of the key points that I make. So apologies, and you'll have to forgive me if I shuffle a few papers as we walk through. But Derek Hoy taught me a lot, particularly when I consider the short space of time that we spent in each other's company. He provided great insight to me in terms of creativity and innovation, and its practical application to computer science for many individuals. I can remember Derek Hoy mostly sitting in a hotel in Dublin. There was an annual conference every year, a Health Informatics Society of Ireland conference, and Derek would come there and we would shoot the breeze over coffee and talk about some of the projects that we could collaborate and work on. And always we ended up drawing diagrams on some piece of paper about how we were going to pull certain architectures together. One of the ones that comes to mind is Snow Cloud, and I have given the link with the notes for these slides so you can see that. And it was one that Professor Nick Hardiger also worked on in terms of the clinical templates and the open EHR community. Now we tried to get some work going with public health nurses in Ireland at the time, and we did some good work there. But like many things, it was very difficult to keep going. But drawing back on the success and the project issue, the people I now work with in public health nursing, and MacDonald being one, is actually working with me still today, many years later, and we're now working on the National Data Dictionary projects together as part of a scholarship group in the new centre. So that's one example of how we take the ideas and we move them forward. I am honoured to be asked to do this talk today and to share the experiences of working with Derek, because despite the short time that we spent together, he was the man who shaped my thinking, and with his passing taught me a very valuable lesson, and that is that I am very careful what I spend my time on now. Lesson 1, invest time with individuals that you know you can work with, and initiatives that are worthwhile. In a space where there's information overload, and it's particularly important, I think, to select, focus and invest your time on what is important. And this may mean that you need to sort of really focus and maybe not have all of these pots all running at the same time and bubbling over, but at the end of the day that you focus solely on 1 or 2 key projects or topics and try and make them happen over a period of time. For the past 2 years, the topic I'm now focusing on is facilitating the digital infrastructure for integrated care. If this task is done well, it is unseen and it's undetected by the clinicians. If it's done badly, we all know about it, and basically it really is a problem and an unworkable solution for any given project. I'm going to talk a little bit about Bertrand Russell here, who is a man from Wales and a philosopher and a political activist in the 1950s. And I particularly like this. The central problem of our age is how to act decisively in the absence of certainty. Nursing, I fear, is not on solid ground these days. People are living with rather than dying from chronic disease. And this presents health and social care and policy analysts with many, many challenges. At a time when nursing voice should be at its strongest, we seem to be staring at this digital patient as if it's a new species of animal. And really it's foreign and alien to us. There are sure pockets of innovation out there and success stories, but globally, in my opinion, nursing lags behind other disciplines. Perhaps we need to consider the pioneers who embraced research in the first instance and delivered many, many wonderful pieces of research to us. In fact, when we talked last night, we talked about ITIN and that newsletter over the years and how useful and important and innovative some of the projects were that were embedded within that. Perhaps we're afraid to make the key decisions that may impact or shape the sustainability for contemporary nursing. I'm not sure. But the individuals who have produced seminal work such as Corbin and Strauss, and who defined trajectory models of care for chronic disease management, were nurses. And then if we look at sociologists like Kathy Shermaz's work in Good Days, Bad Days, where she looked at the self-concepts of chronic illness, these are all incredibly bright and brilliant pieces of work that we can reflect on and are more, in my opinion, relevant today as they were in the past. And they can give us great insights, in my opinion, as to how we can instigate new work today. One of the issues that I actually have been dealing with in my PhD student has been falls prevention. And this is an example of where we got, really somebody getting down to understanding the context and advocating for patients. And I think at the end of the day, a 30% reduction in many of the places where the falls prevention programme has happened is actually worth mentioning. So, silo, curative, fragmented models of care will not provide us with the answers. I could provide all these figures, but I'm sure you know them as well as I do. We've all seen the recent media reports in terms of the predictive models and the global trends. There's no doubt we're living at a time of uncertainty, but one way to act decisively is to see through the fog and to progress the integrated care agenda. We live in a time where boundaries are superimposed on us in society. Those who define the boundaries carry with them great responsibility to not only define both the social boundaries of our society, but also the systems designing and underpinning them, and which govern them. Taking lessons to heart such as the current challenges with the boundaries we face, such as Brexit, I suggest the health informatics community needs to focus carefully and act decisively. We may not be able to shift the boundaries that exist, but we certainly need to be aware of their existence, and we should try and manage them to the best of our ability. And this brings me to the title of the paper in a roundabout way. And the man who inspired me to write it, Dr. Derek Hoy, I can still hear him telling me he's careful with his time and what he invests his energies in. And one thing he did spend his time doing was playing a tune on the fiddle. And that got me thinking about the relationship between music and its structural form. Considering how well composed music takes a wonderful, harmonised and integrated sound, is there any lessons that we can learn in the health informatics community when we consider the delivery of traditional or Celtic music and its associated form? So how can we achieve integrated care acting decisively in our design in order to get the harmonies right? The rest of this paper really is structured using music, and specifically trad music, or as we call it, Celtic music, as a specification, and I mean that in the broadest sense, of how we can provide insights into achieving integrated care. A set of principles to manage those boundaries, or at least recognise them for what they are, because in all cases, it's about acting decisively in design in order to get those harmonies right. As is the case in most music, the student of the Celtic tune learns the songs by breaking them down into a series of technical steps. The rhythm, the style and the key are just some of the examples. Anyone who plays Celtic music will tell you there is a big difference in time signature between a jig and a reel. A reel is played in 4/4 and a jig is played in 6/8. I know this because I checked with my niece Sharon Hussey, who's a fantastic fiddle player, and she told me. For our colleagues who attempt harmonisation in care, selecting the right standards, the signatures, for each step, the technical, the semantic and the functional specifications for integrated care are required to achieve interoperability and optimise harmonisation. One standard that I have found consistently and particularly useful is the reference model for open distributed processing. It provides a coordinating enterprise architecture framework for the standardisation of open distributed processes. As a nurse for 20 years, I need everything simply broken down into bite-sized components or I can't see it. And if I'm honest, this particular standard provides me with a very strong frame of reference to situate all the components required for enterprise architecture. There are other frameworks available such as TOGAF, and I'm sure, Angus, you probably know a few as well that are out there, but really from a clinical perspective and to deliver integrated care from a technical perspective, the RMODP offers me most of what I need to try and do the day job that I'm doing at the moment. So the key processes required to make sense of core ICT requirements. I'm now going to expand a little bit more on these and give you a few examples in some of the slides. Does anyone have any questions? It's as clear as mud then. Okay, we'll keep going. So this is a picture of a Celtic session, which you probably all have seen before. What are the key elements of a good trad music session? Well, firstly, we need to have experienced musicians who understand the importance of team participation and cohesion. The experienced musician lead by example, and they provide a space for playing certain suites of tunes in a cycle, in a progression, with ease and between one-to-many sets of tunes. The key message here is that the interface is seamless and managed. There's no surprises here, and the musicians know by the name of the tunes as they're all well rehearsed over time. All musicians move together. There's a couple of seconds of a break in the tune and then it restarts, often in a different key and tempo. At least it does in Galway and Ireland. Considering this scenario from a computer science perspective for a moment, the following slides identify critical factors that are required to getting the harmony right in integrated care. These examples span a number of years, 30 plus if I'm honest, and are by no means exhaustive. Rather, they are purposely selected to drive home a key point. The challenges we encounter in integrated care persist, and global policy suggests we are not making the expected progress we anticipated. The reference model for open distributed processes and its viewpoints will provide the transition breaks. Just as the musicians shift, so too does the project team between the viewpoints. And there's 5 viewpoints within RMODP. It's well articulated online for those who don't know about it. There's the enterprise viewpoint, which will offer you an example of the foundation stones by which any system would develop. There's the information viewpoint, which looks at the metadata, the data dictionaries, the concepts and the terms. And then we've got the computational layer, and that very much looks at things like the messaging between and across different service providers. technology layer very much looks at hardware. Now I am simplifying here. It's a lot more complicated, but in general this is the way I see it. And then in the engineering side we look at the connectathons and the testing and the conformance and whether or not there's a lag in terms of data being transferred across and between service providers. So some examples from a clinical perspective for the nurses who are listening would be HOBIC. HOBIC is the Health Outcomes for Better Information and Care. It's an interdisciplinary data set from Canada that's been introduced over many years now. Initially set up by Peggy White and Catherine Hanna and Margaret Kennedy. And what they do is they actually admit a patient, use a clinical template and complete it on admission, and then they do again on discharge, and then again in the residential service providers when they leave the acute service. They collect things like nursing sensitive outcomes or physio sensitive outcomes around things like functional status, symptom management. It's not rocket science, but what's useful to know is that the qualifiers that they collect in HOBIC will mark you on a scale of 1 to 5. It's linked to ICNP and SNOMED, and it provides that synergy between and across service providers, so the patient's journey is captured in terms of their outcomes. And it draws in things like whether the person can move from the bed to the chair, or whether the person can move around a room. These are very subtle things to be looking and measuring, but in the sense of the actual client themselves or the service user, they're critically important because they show a direction that I'm getting better, and it helps with the mood.
The Hobbit.
HOBIC, see HOBIC. Yeah. So, example 1 here is from the work that we've been doing in DCU with the HSE in Ireland over the last year. It's firmly located in the bridge building between that information and computational viewpoint, and it's identified in the reference model for open distributed processing. It defines the infrastructure within the associated concepts, and that's syntax for those predefined templates, clinical data architecture from a HL7 perspective. And we list the transactions and the pathways and delivers vital groundwork for interoperability. Mr. Martin Tully, also a Celtic musician by the way, and he plays the concertina, is that it? Yeah, the concertina. And I published this high-level paper to demonstrate the need for a metadata registry framework. And here's the link to the publication, and it's available online. And it is very much focused probably on clinical people or health informatics people rather than technical people, and explaining why we need a national data dictionary. If I go down a level, just as the musicians have access to sheet music, to the tunes they play and the key that they play in, so too does the computer have identity services to distinguish between the organisations, the peoples, the assets and the locations. In Ireland we are working on development of infrastructure to develop the first step in building safe interfaces between delivery of information beyond the boundaries of any one organisation. And this figure here we provide an example of a service and its associated constructs embedded in a data dictionary with associated properties. So this is early work that we're doing with our intellectual disability services. We started an initial scoping exercise. So if you can imagine, in Ireland there will be at least 4 unique numbers or identifiers being rolled out over the next few years. So there's the organisation themselves at the top, and then this is an example here where you have a cluster of hostels in a community called the Glens, and there's a set of houses there which are part of the Glens community. And within each of those houses there is a service user living independently with some supports. So they have an identifier. There is a healthcare professional who has an identifier, and the service user may have a bed or may have a hoist which is unique to them, and they are also identified. So this is kind of critical infrastructure, not necessarily something that you see maybe nurses collecting information on a regular basis, but if we get the foundation stones right, we're not building on sand. So it's important to test and play within the National Data Dictionary on this work. So we're currently looking for a PhD student to do this work with us. We've applied for a PhD student to work with us on this. We picked intellectual disability services because I'm sure more people know about intellectual disability services than I do, but I understand that they have a much more accelerated problem with chronic disease than other groups. For example, people with Down syndrome will have dementia problems because of the association with their genetic mapping and their codes. So people at the age of as early as 35 can develop dementia with intellectual disability. And they're a vulnerable population, and maybe not as well articulated as other areas like the acute models that are already being pushed through. So that's why we've worked with them, and we're at the very early stages of our discussions and scoping out what we can do within our National Data Dictionary. Any questions on that? Okay. So when we think about the role of the academic in designing enterprise architecture and future requirements, we need to recognise that every musician knows the group's skills, expertise and role in delivering the tune. For example, certain tunes require specific musicians to take the lead or to do solo pieces within the fiddle or the wooden flute at specific times in the music. In Ireland, we're rethinking our national data dictionaries for optimal use, providing the specific metadata for stakeholders engaged in the delivery of integrated care. And this could be compared to providing the sheet music to achieve a musical score. There's no doubt computer science is progressing at a rapid pace. Artificial intelligence, robotics, bioinformatics, they are flying, but it's useful to remember the tempo within health and social care is played at a very different pace. For trad music perspective, we would be classified then as a reel. Is that right? Reel, yeah, rather than a jig. Okay, the factors impacting on this would be way beyond the scope of this particular discussion, but patient safety plays a significant part in that too. So, considering the value proposition on how data dictionaries can provide much needed detail to one-to-many stakeholders is an evolving process. Initial steps include rethinking the role of the data dictionaries in advancing integrated care, not just considering data dictionaries as holding spaces for descriptive data. There is opportunities for signposting core infrastructural requirements, identifiers, pathways for syntax, core value sets, version terminology like ICD-10, ICMP and SNOMED International. All of these can be considered relevant and important within the data dictionary. But it is very important on getting the balance and the mix right. And when it comes to considering integrated care, the issue of clinical risk and patient safety cannot be understated. Poor transition in a Cayley would not result in a well played out tune, or the dancers either. In the domain of ICT, conformance testing to ensure wire-to-wire transmissions are 100% accurate, and defining cardinality of the data transactions, are they mandatory, are they optional? This provides much needed detail for conformance testing and certification further down the river. The process of development evolves, as does the technology. So, moving away from Ireland for a wee minute, the Digital Agenda for Europe is providing vital infrastructure to engage in testing. The European Union is investing in digital services infrastructure and providing connectathons for testing conformance of EU digital services in process. Further information is available from this website, and we are all working in terms of the different member states to make sure that we learn from each other, which I think is really important. The European Patient Smart Open Services was the EPSOS project, which was run over a 10-year period and had a number of member states involved for to actually access a prescription across and between different member states, which Ireland wasn't a member by the way, has actually developed a huge amount and bank of really useful resources which are now coming into play in terms of the digital infrastructure. And if anybody wants any further information on that, please give me a shout. Okay? The main thing really to remember is that this approach builds both national and EU capacity and provides a return on investment for our taxpayers, and it avoids the advancement of these black box and vendor lock-in problems that we have across many of our countries at the moment, which keeps our costs up and provides an opportunity for multiple application programming interfaces, which we don't want. So I'm going to go into talking about the role of the academic community from an enterprise architecture viewpoint, and just for a few minutes have a little chat here to you about fiat and bona fide boundaries, which is not something that anybody wants to take to bed with them and read at night. Okay? It's useful if you're interested in language and terminology to look at this. Okay? But we're only going to tip it today. I've mentioned the boundaries and specifically the social boundaries a few times in this talk. Understanding the notion of the social fiat boundaries and their dependencies is a critical factor when defining semantic interoperability. For those interested in this space, do absolutely read this paper by Barry Smith. He talks about the metaphysical world and he talks about ontologies. But the key thing really is that the single organisational agenda prevails. We don't necessarily see, from our perspective, that it is about, from the patient's lens, they're crossing one-to-many different service providers. And we need to remember as well that, when we introduce these changes in these large organisations, that there's two parts to change. There's the change, which is the process, and then there's the transition, which is the emotionally charged piece, where people have invested in, particular processes in their organisation and are quite precious about it and don't want to be asked to move. It's not part of today's script, but certainly there's some resources in here within this presentation that people can go back and have a look at if they wish. Again, I'm just pulling some things up that I've found very useful over the years, rather than actually saying that they are the only definitive pieces of work. This is from the Care Atlas from the US Agency for Health Research and Quality. It's quite old, it's 2012 they started this work. I thought this was a wonderful piece of work that was completed. And I use it a lot with my students, and the reason for that is that it shows in one graphic why we have so many issues around care coordination and mapping in and tooling into care coordination. So the size of the triangle is actually dictating whether or not the complexity is low, if the patient's capacity is high, and if the care coordination need is minimal. While in scenario 2, where we have somebody who has a high complexity, low patient capacity, they don't understand what medications they're taking. They don't understand the different colours in warfarin. They don't understand, that if their feet are swelling, that they need to put them up, or they may need to go back to see their GP, that their water retention is higher than it should be. And the care coordination needed is extensive. And this is where integrated care comes into its own. This is where the down the road, financial savings would be, but more importantly, the patient outcomes are best impacted upon or maintained at a current level. So I think, as I said, I couldn't actually find the reference for that up on the website, but if you go into the US Agency for Health Quality and Research, there are other references which actually do refer to it. Again, work that's happened in the UK and in Europe, which you probably are familiar with, and if you're not, it might be useful for you to look at. Talking about continuity of care, the clinical process then comes into play. So progressing with the traditional music notion, additional core factors influencing a good Cayley session, for example, in addition to the musicians, is that the instruments used by the musicians are to a good standard and are fit for purpose. The health informatics standards community provide consistent standards to support integrated care. And one standard that I've invested time with is the systems of concepts for continuity of care. Now in SEN and ISO standard, the development of which is led out by Mr. Nick Overidge, who you probably know. This resource is online and available for all of you to look at it, and it provides some really interesting detail around the care flows and the concepts that are needed for continuity of care. I also have mentioned there on the bottom right hand side a link to the Joint Initiative Council report, which was published in February of this year. That is, again, Stephen Kay has been involved in that, and multiple stakeholders from the UK have been involved in this work, as well as in America and Canada and around the world. And they've put their hearts and souls into developing up a use case for a patient summary record. And it's set up in chapters, and there's lots of hyperlinks into different resources from the HL7 community and from the SNOMED community that you can have a look at if you want to. And certainly it is something you would read in an afternoon and then follow up on. So again, useful tools to think about as we move forward. I haven't actually got the reference to this other than the link below, and I have given Sharon the proper reference for it, and apologies to everybody for that. I think I might have been just multitasking too much last week. But ultimately, at the end of the day, this is a wonderful paper that I recommend everybody reads. As someone who comes from a family of traditional musicians, I can vouch that much practice is needed for consistently over many years to learn the tunes played in a Cayley music session. We will avoid talking about what a novice fiddler sounds like when they're practicing, so I think really at the end of the day, what we're looking at is an accessible and clinically pragmatic framework to address key challenges in the domains of interactions between them. And this is the work of Patricia Greenhalgh and her team, published I think around November of last year, a wonderful paper with incredible rigour in terms of theory testing, and to look at really how and why different systems fail, where they're non-adopted or abandoned in the process of being delivered. And how, when we look at these frameworks, that we can actually get some insight into whether or not we think this will actually work in the real world. Is there sustainability on these projects that we're about to start or not? So it's not meant to be a formula. There's a set of questions in table 2 on this paper which I'd recommend people look at. And there is a series, you can see there, 1 to 7 different domains that they put the questions to. But ultimately, it won't work as sort of like a deterministic piece of work to say, if I get the box ticked on all of these, I'm up and running. What it is doing is it's giving you good insight into whether or not your project actually is going to be complex, difficult, or simple. And in the end of the day, understanding that from the outset might be a useful bit of time to spend working on. One of the key things that was pulled from this report as well, when they looked at different systems that were failing or not getting sustainability, was that only a fraction of the potential end users in the case studies examined were assessed by their clinicians as suitable for the technology. So what does that tell us? I mean, we seem to be making the same mistakes over and over again. So I'm not sure how we can fix that, but this type of work I think is critically important to make sure that we, invest wisely, given our current global trends in chronic disease management. So I'm coming to the end of my lecture, probably earlier than I should be, I'm not sure, but I'm going to read this last piece, and then I'll take questions if there's any, if that's all right. So, harmonisation is a primary step in service delivery, and yet from the service user's perspective we seem to fail iteratively because we try to achieve our goals in a siloed and fragmented way. It's easy to become despondent. I selected music today as it has a way of crossing those boundaries. Derek's engagement, like my family's engagement in traditional music, provides an opportunity to come together to create something lyrical, which then brought together is greater than the sum of its individual parts. Session musicians are experts in their activity, knowing the tunes they provide a natural rhythm and a predictable sound with well-rehearsed tunes. They join in and they leave with ease, with minimal impact on the group cohesion and the associated sound of that tune being played. Yet each rendition of a song created is a unique sound, and that collectively creates more than one solitary attempt to replicate the notes on a sheet of music. The sound creates its own identity, and with it provides a synergy to lift people. The musician picks up his instrument and plays the well-rehearsed tune, with a pace and unique style to his or her personhood. From observing Derek in teaching, I probably get upset. We joined the session, I sat back and listened with ease. And his admiration of his style to teach and to show how he can do what he did well. Derek would draw people into the world of possibilities, perhaps giving the students the time and space to reflect on his stories. Innovation in healthcare may seem a bit dull. Just as Derek would light up the room with some tunes, we need to manage these transitions. And I think I'll leave it at that. And the notes are up if anyone wants to read the rest. Thank you very much.
I found the link to music just fascinating. It really is a wonderful link to Derek, his work, your work, and it really brings it down to earth for me. I wanted to ask you, we're here on behalf of the British Computer Society, Health and Care Scotland, here at the Royal College of Nursing in Scotland. You talk about the role of academia. Is there a role for charities, organizations like ours in promoting this agenda?
I think there is, and I think that whole notion of the synergy is really important, and the consortiums, moving forward with consortiums and working within groups. Not having, individual siloed groups, and having a group of people that you can work with and trust to develop together. And then I think you get that balance right. But I think for me, and it's not the same I think in the UK, but in Ireland, our funding structures have been set up over the years where they were very much organisation by organisation or region by region. And that created a sense of competition to some extent, which is not necessarily conducive to integrated care. So I think charities provided, to some extent, a really good linkage across and between the different entities that we're talking about. I think there's a myth that academics are, you know, in ivory towers and are not necessarily in the real world. And I find that hard to accept, because I am at my core an implementation researcher, and having spent 20 years in clinical practice, I'm very keen to make sure anything I do has a value. Gosh knows, we put enough hours into it, you know. It has to make a difference, and all of us are mothers, daughters, you know, fathers, sons, and we can see across the continuum at the moment just the impact that this global trend with chronic disease management is having, with depression rising to the fore and the Sustainable Development Goals. So I think we have a lot of work to do, but I think we have to sort of shift the focus a wee bit, and charities will have a key role to play in that.
Okay, I promise not to ask you about Brexit. Any other questions? Shan.
Ask, you mentioned some examples of working with your students. What are your thoughts, please, on how best to equip students coming into health and social care with the skills that they need to contribute to this agenda?
Could you just repeat the question? So
what role does education have in terms of equipping the students with digital care? Well, I think we have a very important role. I think for me, any assignments that I set with my students tend to be very much focused in their practice. So the project would be a precursor to something happening in the real world. So they would come into the university and they would have, certainly at a postgraduate level, they would have an idea, something to challenge a problem on the ground. And I was explaining there just before, one of the modules I run at the moment, Informatics and eHealth, is only 12 weeks long. I think it's not that expensive to do a single module. It's a level 9, but the students can come in, and last year one of my students, a physiotherapist, did a wonderful piece of work on tendon and ligament repair using, you know, a website, a dedicated website with video. Certainly at the undergraduate level, I think we need to get better in synergy around our education of nursing documentation. I think we need to stop this siloed, fragmented, Roper, Logan, Tierney, Orem, NANDA, ICMP. We need to sort of make our mind up what it is we're doing, and like other disciplines, get going with that. So I think there's a real opportunity for us to drive the informatics competencies forward through undergraduate. It will take time, but other countries, and Ireland now has informatics embedded in its undergraduate programme, which I'm delighted about. Yeah.
Yeah, please.
So I agree. I think there's a role for education to empower the students to be able to come out of university with these ideas around about informatics or about, you know, standardised note keeping. But my experience from that is that once they get out into clinical practice, then the powers that be, and in a musical sense, are playing a lot louder than the students and new qualified people are being. So what is the role for the clinicians, current clinicians, to support these students that are coming out with some informatics knowledge?
Yeah, and I think I often say to people don't know what they don't know. And if we have people in clinical practice who don't know what they don't know, it's very hard for them to support students coming in with new knowledge in regard to the informatics agenda. I think social media is very important in that respect, and we've been using, with eHealth Ireland, we've been using social media quite effectively. And with my students, I'm not sure about you, I'm sure you're the same, like the first thing I do is I get them up on Twitter. I only use Twitter for access. So like Tricia Greenhald's paper there that I described in her team, that's a really good example of how you can push out really good evidence to your students, so they can go back to the clinician and go, look at this is important, you know, this is why but it has to be a twin-pronged approach. It has to be a bottom-up and a top-down in the clinical environment. And I also think there needs to be a massive shift from the acute services into the community. I mean, we don't have, there's a really good paper in the WHO report from the Lancet on a predictive model for 2030, and the figures are staggering. We just don't have the resources globally to deliver healthcare in this way. I mean, people are waiting a week, you know, to see a GP at the moment, and we haven't even tipped over yet that scales. It's coming, where we get to a point where it can be really difficult. On the plane on the way over, I was saying to Sharon last night, I found an advertisement for it's videodoc.ie, you know, and videodoc.uk, 20 euros to see a doctor, you know. I'm sure it'll work for some people, but I'm not sure what the quality of the service will be. It may be brilliant, who knows. So yeah, I think it's got to be no one-way fix is this. It's complex and it has multiple layers, but we have to get the message across, and we start with the undergraduates and try and get them to move on.
Social media, is that acceptable now in NHS Lothian? Is that allowed?
Mm-hmm.
It's changing.
It's changing.
It's just changed. The policies just told us what we can do now. We can use Facebook, but if we're to use it in appropriate, you know.
Yeah, appropriately.
Could I be a wee bit controversial and say it has changed, and it's the same in other boards and, you know, other areas, but quite a bit overdue. Do you know, I think it's changed to now to it's a very positive place where yes, Facebook, Twitter can be used for professional purposes, which is right, but that should have been changed a number of years ago. That's not a 2016, I think it was maybe the review, but that was a 2006 or, you know, problem or an
ECC doesn't
issue.
work for us anymore.
What was it, sorry?
ECC don't work.
Well, this is it. Yeah, well, I like to do it because I'm not an employee. Okay, but I think it's positive that we're, because there are still other boards who do not allow social media, and that's criminal. Do that's
What's happening in
And
Ireland?
shackles.
Do you allow social media access?
We had some issues over the years, and we have a set of principles that the Nursing Midwifery Board of Ireland have established. I was actually working on that with the nursing board, and it's quite good, and it's, you know, simple, basic, common sense approach. You know, if someone's looking over your shoulder, imagine what you should be putting down, and no shouting, and, you know, using capitals. But yeah, look, I think you're always going to have people who are going to abuse the system, but I think the value of keeping people current. I don't use Twitter to tell anybody what I'm having for dinner. In fact, I very rarely use Twitter. I probably only put, you know, 2 or 3 things up a month. But the point is that if there's something important that I want to share with my students, that's where they're going to find it, if they left the classroom. Yeah.
There's a question from...
Yeah, someone online who's watching the stream is just asking if the slides are going to be available online. Later.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, because I couldn't finish the talk, because I'm a bit of a softie really underneath it all, the last slide I'd ask people to read. Yeah.
So it will be available.
With the notes, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Marina.
I'd asked Shan a question earlier, and then now asking yourself in terms of models for competencies for different levels of post-reg nurses in informatics competencies. I know you've looked at these type of things across the world.
Yeah.
What's your thoughts? We have to work something out for our board, and we have our own nurses, 16,000 of them.
I like the Canadians. I like the work that the Canadians have done on the undergraduate. The CASN, I should know what the acronym stands for, but I don't. I think they're a very good foundational step. You can certainly have a look at the Irish ones from undergrad. On a postgrad level, you see, I come back to the same point, you know, one size doesn't fit all. So are we looking at postgraduate in a health informatics environment, or in an AMP environment, and in a nursing environment?
In a ward environment.
In a ward environment for
postgraduate. Just now, for getting what's been identified is that although they've had some training, their skills and knowledge and confidence and competence probably in managing the vast electronic patient record still needs to be developed. So we need to work out on how we do that, so that we improve data quality, improve efficiency, and, you know, potentially improve outcomes for patients. But there's a group of staff who probably just about slightly younger than me, who weren't in the group, who grew up with all the technologies. They're not the new post-grad students, they're the other cohort in the middle.
Yeah.
And it's to work out if there's models that out there that we've looked at.
Okay, well, I think one thing that could happen, and again, I've been doing some work with the ICN in the last month, with Professor Nick Hardiker as well on the ICNP agenda. And I really do, and I was saying this to Sharon as well, I mean, do you have an ICNP R&D centre in England or Scotland or Wales? And if you haven't, why haven't you? Because the R&D centre that I set up for ICNP, which is at the core of our Centre for Integrated Care, offers scholarship for our postgraduates to come in and work. So some of the people who've done the module with me last year have now set up the scholars group, and they're looking at electronic records and thinking about it. So there's a space for them to come and get support if they need it. And I think again it comes back to that consortium I'm talking about. So like if you're in a clinical environment and you're very, very busy, and whoever's in practice development there, they could do with a bit of help. And that's something that the academic community can offer, or the RCN can offer. So look towards building centres to support and provide scholarship, and let them grow organically, because you may have a predefined idea of what they need, but believe me, in a year's time it could look very, very different. You know, so not thinking too far in, but just recognising that, you know, at different points you build and scope out, and then you review and see, okay, what are the projects that came to the fore this year or last year, and what do they need people want next year. We also have an MOU with our older person services, and the clinical nurse specialists have all come in, and they've made decisions. And one of our clinical nurse specialists had a diary of all of the tissue viability issues in her service. And one of our academics, who's a very strong quant, went, this is gold dust, this is fantastic, we can actually work with this and we can do great things. So it was that bringing them two together, you know, keep bringing the people together who have the expertise with the problems, and I think that's a good way to go.
And make some music.
Yeah, make some music. Exactly.
Christine.
I just wanted to ask if there's the equivalent conversations and work going on in social care. Do they have the equivalent of e-health and codes and academics? I don't know what they're called, social care informatics. Is that?
Yeah, well, one of the people who teaches into the informatics and e-health module, for example, is a background in social work, and he comes in and he talks about the social work piece. And again, it is multidisciplinary. It's not just nurses who can come on the course. Many people come on the course that are nurses, but it's open to other people. I'm not sure, Christine, about what's happening within the social care general overview, but one of the things that we are doing at the moment in Ireland, which I think is worthy of mention, is that there's a policy called Healthy Ireland, and that Healthy Ireland has had a number of spin-off programmes being set up. So one of them is running from Cork with Professor Eileen Savage on looking at self-management support and looking at motivational interviewing, and we are writing all academic institutions are coming together for all healthcare professionals. So, you know, it would be psychology or medicine or physio or nursing, and they are actually pulling together the curriculum for the undergraduate as core, and then it can be adapted locally. So that, I think, starts to deal with what you're asking around the community and the social side of things. That partnership of SMS that we need to build with our clients, social care will have a huge impact on that. Yeah.
What's your experience, Christine, answering the same question here for
Things have
Scotland?
changed quite dramatically in Scotland because they've dropped the quality outcomes framework, which was a way of, in general practice, of coding everybody diabetes or asthma or COPD, and each general practice would get points according to how, you know. So that has changed things really quite dramatically around about standards and multimorbidity, you know, and it's acknowledging that people really have 3 or 4 or 5 different conditions, and actually you could maybe in some cases just put code complex, and if they're admitted to out of hours or whatever, people understand what that is, you know. Socially they're isolated, they're on their own, they maybe don't have benefits, or plus they've got 3 or 4 different conditions. And your slide about complexity, low complexity, high complexity, you know, it might be that might be the future, that people are trusted to assign a code just to say this person's got a lot of things happening, and here are the key issues for information.
Yeah, I mean, I do think, I keep going back to this boundaries thing because I think it's very important. I mean, we structure everything through these boundaries, these field boundaries now. And even if we look at health and how it's sliced, you know, through the specialist medical model, I mean, I'm not saying that we don't need it, we do need it, but we also need the other pieces where people are seen holistically. And with the community and the self-management support and the symptom management and the primary and secondary prevention stuff in the community, this stuff has to, you know, we have to start to recognise that those boundaries exist and try and find ways around them. And to me, the integrated care agenda and the technology in the future is there to do that. But as long as we keep looking in the siloed way at this is our trust, for want of a better way of putting it, you know, and this is where the boundaries start and finish, and what happens when that person walks through the door is not our problem, you know, or outside the trust, then, you know, we're failing to recognise the complexity of healthcare, real healthcare in the future. Because none of us really know what's around the corner with our dwindling resources.
Great, and we'll leave it like that. Nobody knows what's around the corner. Thank you very much. Really enjoyed your talk. So join me in making some noise for Pam. Thank you to people who joined us online. The slides will be available and the recording will also be available, and I'll send an email around with the exact URL, but probably the same URL as you're seeing the live streaming now. So thank you very much. Great.